Okay, good morning. We're going to have a lecture on the heart. That's the next unit. We'll take a break and have the test. So the heart is just one component of what's called the cardiovascular system. Let me turn the mic down. Hold on. It's too loud. Okay, try that. Cardiovascular system, sometimes called circulatory system. What does it circulate? Blood. And in fact, the premier journal in heart disease is Circulation. Okay, that's the #1 research journal for this field. And the organs are the heart, the vasculature, and the blood. The heart, which we'll study today, chapter 18. In fact, each of these topics is its own chapter, its own test. The heart is lecture exam 3. The vasculature, the blood vessels, is 4. Blood, along with other things, is lecture exam 5. So they're each big topics. The heart is the muscular pump that pumps blood into the arteries. And everyone knows that the heart pumps blood, but something you have to realize is if the heart is going to pump blood, it must first receive blood. Must first receive blood from veins. So the way we say it is, when you pump blood out of the heart into the arteries, we call that cardiac output. That's the phrase. You pump blood out. the output, the performance of the heart. That's his job, to pump blood. And on average, just giving a ballpark, the heart can pump 5 liters of blood in about a minute. Okay. During the condition of exercise, when the metabolic demand increases, that could increase to 35 liters a minute. So just in terms of volume per unit time, that's kind of some textbook numbers. And everyone's familiar with your heart rate, the beats per minute. So, you know, heart rate, HR, or beats per minute. You know, you take your pulse, right? I mean, this isn't my heart, right? This is the radial artery. My heart's here. But obviously, the heart is pumping blood to the arteries, and this is an artery that I'm feeling. And that pulse that you feel is the heart rate. And, you know, textbook average, 75 BPM. You know, a lot of these textbook averages are based on a man, 5'10", 175 pounds. Okay. And actually, per beat, the heart may eject about 70 ml of blood. The heart ejects 70 ml blood. Pushing out that production. So 70 ml, you can do the math. It comes out close to 5 liters. And they call this number, the 70 ml, the stroke volume. So I'm just trying to give you some introductory terms. The heart beats, good. Know that term, cardiac output. Know that term, stroke volume. And know your averages. Average BPM, 75 BPM, okay? I mean, a younger person's going to be lower, all right? But the average man, something like that. So we're going to talk mostly about the anatomy today, not the physiology. The vasculature, I've already mentioned. We have arteries and we have veins. Let me here. I'm just going to call them blood vessels, also known as vasculature. A vessel carries something. These carry the blood. Just think of blood vessels as containers for blood. Blood container. I mean, there's different kinds of blood vessels. I already mentioned 2. Arteries. Remember this rule. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. They receive the cardiac output. That's one type. Okay, and they have structure that you'll get into. I don't want to get too into it. And then the goal of the arteries is you distribute blood to all the capillary beds so that all the cells in your body can be nourished. And so capillaries are an exchange medium. And that's what gives us life. Okay. Arteries are just the deliverers. They got the blood, and you get it to the capillaries. You get exchange one way or the other, and then you have to collect this spent blood, and that's the job of the veins. Veins always return blood to the heart, and we call it venous return. I'll say they accomplish venous return. accomplish venous return. So those are the three major types of blood vessels. Just remember the rules. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins always return blood to the heart. Just remember, vein in. There's an in vein. Let's take blood back into the heart. Okay. And students like to memorize other rules which aren't good, like, oh, arteries always carry oxygenated blood. That's not true. That gets reversed in pulmonary circulation and fetal circulation. Forget that rule. It doesn't hold true. This rule is always true. I've never seen an opposite exception or anything. Okay, then the whole point of the cardiovascular system, you're circulating the blood. Blood is constantly moving. If blood even slows down in its flow, you'll have spontaneous strokes because the clotting factors will have a chance to accumulate. So then you have the life-giving blood. Life-giving, always hear that. People donate blood. It's very valuable. And, well, why? Because, well, there's fractions of blood, but just to give you one note. Carries O2. Okay? Because blood, about half of it is hematocrit, red blood cells, and they have the molecule hemoglobin that can bind O2. Hemoglobin. Well, we have a whole chapter on blood, but that's really why people call it life-giving. Your blood carries the oxygen for the cells. Okay. Think how much you weigh. The average adult only has about 5 liters. That's not a very large percentage of your body weight. That's the average blood volume. I said that cardiac output is about 5 liters a minute. So you're circulating your entire blood volume every minute of your life. So it's very precious. You start bleeding, it doesn't take much blood loss for you to go into shock. Maybe you lose 1 liter of that 5 liters, and your blood pressure starts to plummet. And then there's not enough pressure to push blood to your vital organs, and, well, you could die, obviously. So, that's why blood is very precious. There's not very much of it, and it's always circulating. So today, I've talked about circulation before, but I didn't really talk about pulmonary circulation. This figure teaches students how blood circulates. It's a double loop. Okay. The way they do this is they put the lungs up here to illustrate the pulmonary circuit, and put the whole body down here to illustrate the systemic circuit. And we also see that the heart has a right and left side. So there's 2 hearts. Essentially a right heart and a left heart. Let's talk about the pulmonary circuit first. A circuit is a circle. You go out and you come back. Blood goes round and round. It circulates. This wasn't always known. Okay, we know it now. The pulmonary circuit, let's start from the right heart. Now, it's always the patient's perspective. You tell me, is the right heart red or blue? Blue. It's blue. Okay, and it's labeled there, right atrium, right ventricle. Let's just call it right heart for now. Blue symbolizes deoxygenated blood, oxygen poor, or CO2 rich. And so if the blood being received by the right heart is deoxygenated, it's got to pump it to the lungs to get oxygen. Right heart receives deoxygenated blood. So it uses the pulmonary arteries to pump that blood to the lungs. pumps the spent blood, pumps blood to lungs. So, I'll say via pulmonary arteries. Okay, I'm going to use blue to underline it because the pulmonary arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood. Students have a hard time understanding this. I don't know why. Somehow it must be in pop culture that arteries always carry oxygenated blood. It's not true. Okay, you're in a real class now. Pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood, and it's always an easy question on the test if you can just remember how blood circulates. Think about it. Blood is deoxygenated. Well, what's the function of blood? It's to carry oxygen. So if it's deoxygenated or poorly oxygenated, you want to get it to the lungs to get oxygen. So these arteries carry oxygen or blood away from the heart to the lungs. You force it through pulmonary capillaries, gas exchange occurs at pulmonary capillaries. Now, I'm going to underline half blue and half red to symbolize you pick up O2. As long as you're breathing the fresh air, you're going to pick up O2. Now you need pulmonary veins to collect this oxygenated blood and return it to the left heart. Pulmonary veins return oxygenated to left heart. So pulmonary veins are oxygenated blood. And we made it back. That's the circuit. You go out and you come back, that's it. Period. So then we've accomplished oxygenating the blood. Now it's job of the left heart to pump this oxygenated blood to the whole body. So that's a systemic circuit. Left heart pumps blood to the whole body via systemic arteries. And these are the ones that are going to give you a headache because when we get to blood vessels, they've been named. That means you got to know them. Okay? But just conceptually, they're carrying oxygen-rich blood. It's the pressure in these arteries that you monitor in patients carefully, okay, especially if they're in the ICU or something. If blood pressure changes, it's an emergency, okay? You don't want this to change. You want it to stay nice and steady. When you go to the doctors, they usually report it as two numbers, right? 120 over 80 is an average blood pressure of the systemic arteries. Now, pressure is a physics term. Pressure is a force. And in terms of blood pressure, it's the pressure of the fluid blood pushing against the vessel wall. And that's the force that drives it forward to the capillaries. And the unit of pressure, which is never reported, just unitless numbers, but you should know, it's millimeters of mercury. mm, Hg, Hg, that's just the textbook average. Usually when they measure your blood pressure, you're seated and you're rested. Okay, they put the BP cuff around your arm to block off flow to the brachial artery. It's uncomfortable because it's tight, then they let the air sizzle out. And at some point, they can tell when blood starts to blood flow is restored through that artery, and we can measure those pressures, okay? And this pressure is enough to push it to the capillaries. And if pressure isn't high enough, blood will stop flowing. So that's why it's a vital sign. Millimeters of mercury is the pressure at which you can displace a column of fluid. Okay? In physics, they teach other units of pressure. But anyways, okay, this is the most important vital sign that your systemic arteries have blood pressure. The systemic arteries deliver oxygenated blood to systemic capillaries. And that is where you have the gas exchange. So it comes in oxygen rich, it leaves oxygen poor, so I'll underline it half red, half blue. And then systemic veins collect this spent blood and return it to the right heart. Systemic veins collect, quote unquote, spent blood and return it to right heart. We're back where we started. So spend time, I'm giving you copious notes because I know you have a test, you're not exactly too focused on the next unit when you have a test hanging over your head. But if you don't understand this, stop and wait until you get it and have it memorized before you start studying anything else or you just get lost in the details. This is as basic as we can make it in terms of how blood circulates, okay? You have the basic blood vessels, you know how it gets back and forth, and think about how genius this is that we have a 4-chambered heart and it's divided right in the middle here so that oxygen rich and oxygen poor, they don't mix. In other animals, it does mix. In some animals, I think amphibians, birds, they have a single ventricle. So it's blood mixing and it's not as efficient. But ours is a 4-chamber heart and it's right and left and it's clearly, well, the only way you can force blood from right heart to left heart is through the capillaries, right? The only way you can get from left heart back to right heart is through the capillaries. You should note that. Okay? There's no blood mixing within the heart. So here's the classic frontal section of the heart. And what I like about our heart models is they sit on the stand in the anatomical position. Let me get one. As you can see, we have the small hearts and the big hearts. And of course, you have to know both. And of course, you have to know any heart I may show you on a test, quiz, or exam, right? You study one heart, you study them all. And when you look at cadavers, the amazing thing is they all look the same, but they all look different. Some are bigger, some are smaller. It's kind of amazing. But so you should be able to apply your heart anatomy knowledge to any heart that's shown to you, okay? If you can't do that, something's missing. It's pretty basic. This is not how the body sits in the chest. This is not how the heart sits in the chest. This implies that these chambers are above these chambers, and that's not true. So this is how the heart is in the picture, okay, like this, but it really sits like that. Okay, so I like how so you're always reminded how the heart sits in your chest by just looking at it on the stand. It's not quite like this, but this is good for teaching purposes. So what we see here is that the heart has 4 chambers, 2 on the right, 2 on the left. So let's define those 4 chambers of the heart. Clear the board. You know, the heart has a lot of symbolism and culture and history. I read that the ancient Aztecs, they used to eat the hearts of their vanquished enemies because they thought they, I don't know, inherited some mystical powers when they did that. The heart is just basically like steak. It's mostly meat. And on Monday, we're going to do a heart dissection. You'll get to really see what heart is like. All right, so remember I said that the hearts must first receive blood if they're going to pump blood. The receiving chambers are the two atria, the one on the left and the one on the right. So the four chambers of the heart. Two atria. You have a right atrium, RA for short. You have a left atrium. So these are your receiving chambers, okay? Receive blood. They both receive blood. Remember, veins in. So if they receive blood, remember it's the veins that return blood to the heart, so you have to know the veins that drain into each of these chambers. So for the right atrium, superior inferior vena cava. Superior inferior vena cava. That's blood from the whole body being drained to those two vessels and drained into the right atrium. So the right atrium is receiving blood from superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and I'll throw in a third one called the coronary sinus. The sinus is another name for a different type of blood vessel. It's like a vein. It's a big floppy vein, but it's a blood vessel. So those three all drain the deoxygenated blood to that one chamber, the right atrium. Okay. All right. So the left atrium, there are 4 pulmonary veins. I mean, there's 2 right and there's 2 left. For a total of 4. And you can see them on the picture. They're colored red. Two on the left and 2 on the right. Total of 4. They're all draining into this chamber here. Okay, so those are your receiving chambers. Those veins are all returning blood to these 2 chambers. And then blood will flow forward to the ventricles. The atria lie posterior to the ventricles, not superior to the ventricles as the picture indicates. Okay. So again, always look at your heart model. The ventricles kind of point towards you, and you turn it around, the atria are behind it. We'll look at more pictures later. Atria lie posterior to ventricles. Okay, so your 2 ventricles, these are the pumping chambers. You could say they're more important for that reason. So the atria receive the blood. Blood will then flow forward to the ventricles. Call these the pumping chambers. You have left ventricle and you have right ventricle. again, you should be able to identify it. It's always the patient's perspective. Left, and then right. It's a little tricky, you know. You always have to remember it's the patient's perspective. The left ventricle, that's the ventricle that's going to pump blood to the whole body. So it's very important to know the artery that's attached to it, that receives blood from it. It's the aorta. Well, you can see it right there. It's kind of behind the pulmonary trunk there. But blood goes in there and it's going to flow up through there. So know that the aorta is receiving blood from the left ventricle. LV for short. Aorta, the artery. The other one, the right ventricle, is pumping blood into this structure. This is an artery. It's the pulmonary trunk. RV, pulmonary trunk. They're both arteries, but those are their names. Okay? But they function as arteries. That means blood is flowing away from the heart. See if you're awake this morning by looking at the colors, which artery is carrying deoxygenated blood? Pulmonary trunk. This one. You know, the shapes of the ventricles aren't exactly the same. They kind of look similar in this picture, but they're not exactly the same. You see how, like, this one kind of funnels up to this, like, little cone-shaped area? This area of the right ventricle is called the Conus Arteriosus because it's funneling blood up to this artery. So note that. Right ventricle has a Conus Arteriosus. You can look that up in the book. The left ventricle doesn't have a named area, okay, like that. So know that for the right ventricle. All right, so we got our two ventricles for a total of 4 chambers. You know the vessels that are kind of receiving blood or draining blood into the heart. The other thing is the heart has 4 valves. Okay. Now, 2 of the valves, do you see how they're open downwards here? These 2 are the atrioventricular valves. So you could either call it the right atrioventricular valve, and the other one is the left atrioventricular valve. And by the name, you can tell what they're between, the atria and the ventricles, right? So you have a right. I'll go AV for short, and left AV valve, and that's an acceptable abbreviation. I just wanted to write it out for you one time. I usually say just AV valve. People know what I mean. But you got to know there's a right and a left one. So in identifying it, you just can't say AV valve, right? Because there's 2 of them. So is it the right one or the left one? Now the right one you can't see because they cut it open. The right one has 3 cusps. It's a tricuspid valve, also known as, you know. And the left one is a bicuspid valve. The purpose of valves, any valve in circulation, it prevents backwards flow of blood. That's really why you need valves. Just remember lab rat. Left atria bicuspid, right atria tricuspid. Okay, so you don't confuse left and right there. And so these valves, well, they can, it's simple. A valve can be open and closed. Notice that when these valves are open, blood flows forward from atria to ventricles so they can fill with blood so you can pump it. So these two valves open into ventricles. So blood can fill them. I think that's easy enough to understand. The thing about these valves, they have other structures associated with it. So it's like, there's the cusp of the valve, but then there's these heartstrings that lead to a little muscle down there. So it's like you have the cusp of the valve. That's the barrier. Okay, when those cusps closed, whether it's the bi or tricuspid, they prevent blood from flowing backwards into the atria. Okay, but that's the cusp. But then there's these heartstrings, really tough and white, and they kind of attach to the insert in this little muscle there. The heartstrings are called the chordae tendineae. You can pluck them like strings, but the proper anatomy name is chordae tendineae. That's what you got to go with in this class. And that little nipple-shaped muscle is called the papillary muscle. Papilla means nipple-shaped. Papillary muscle. So in identifying the valve, the cusp is the actual valve part of the valve. But know that these valves have heartstrings and the papillary muscle. So it goes cusp, heartstrings, papillary. The other two valves are called semilunar valves. Notice how these valves, like they're going to open up into the arteries. You have two semilunar valves. Now they're called semilunar because a cusp is like half of a moon shape. So you have an aortic and pulmonary semilunar valve. I'm just going to go with SL valve for short. So these two valves, they open into the arteries. That way the arteries can carry blood away from the heart. So when they close, they prevent the blood from going backwards into the ventricles, because the ventricles is supposed to pump blood out. Okay. Well, if it's called pulmonary SL valve, you know it's the one on the right side, because it's the one that acts as a valve for the pulmonary trunk in the right ventricle. And here's the aorta, so you know that valve kind of hidden there is the one for the left ventricle and the aorta. Here's the app. I haven't used it yet this semester, but I wanted to show you what you can see there. Just for presentation purposes, I have something here with the heart. Let's go with that. I have the heart isolated. I like this, they made it so you can kind of see the heart beat. What you should notice in the beating heart is, see these little Dumbo ears? That one and that one. Those are a part of the atrium, and they're called auricles. Let me write that down. So you have, I'm going to finish with the valves. You have right and left auricles. Auricle means ear, ear shape. And these are associated with the right and left atria. Just so the auricles are a part of the atria, the receiving chambers. Notice that the two atria pump together, and then the two ventricles pump together. One landmark right there, that whitish line, a little sulcus, that's the dividing line between right and left. Okay? And you can see all the vessels attached to it. So what I like about the app is it has animation. You can just kind of touch and like rotate it. So this is the back of the heart. This is the right atrium. That's the right auricle. So remember you listed in your notes 2 veins that drain into it. What's that one? Inferior vena cava, superior vena cava. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, what? Pulmonary veins draining into the left atrium. Okay, so that's a posterior view. So here's the anterior view. Here's my landmark, the anterior interventricular sulcus. Write that down. Anterior, so you know it's the front. Interventricular. Sulcus. A sulcus is a groove. That groove carries fat and coronary vessels. We'll get to that, but it's your landmark. Like for example, on Monday, when you get the heart in your hands, the first thing you got to do is, well, it's not a picture in the book. It's an actual thing in your hands. You got to figure out, well, what's the front, what's the back? That's the first most important challenge. Because if you get that wrong, everything else is wrong, right? You can't study the front and think it's the back and get things right. It's impossible. Look for this. Because you know that's the front, and then once you know that, that's the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Then you're off to a really good start on your dissection. If you want to stop beating, you can just double tap it if you have the app. Let me see if I can do that. Stop. Okay, there it goes. I've highlighted the wall of the right ventricle. Okay. For those of you who don't have the app, you can just watch the YouTube. But I want to hide it. And then I want to highlight the wall of the left side, the left ventricle, and I want to hide that so we can get an interior view of the heart. I just want you to see the valves in action. So I'm going to turn the lights off a little bit. These two, are they the AV or the SL? These two. AV. These are the 2 AV valves. Is that right or left? Think patient's perspective. Right, left. Notice how they open and close together. Okay, and you can see the heartstrings and the papillary muscle there. So that's tri-bicuspid. You kind of have to rotate a little to see the semilunar valves. I want to rotate up there. There's the pulmonary semilunar valve. I count 3 cusps, but you can see it opening and closing. What you should notice is, do you see how like when this is open and that's closed and vice versa? Right? They're never open at the same time. They might be closed at the same time, but they're never open at the same time. But we'll get into the cardiac cycle later. But let me show you the other valve. It's kind of hidden. There it is. Right there. Oh, which one is it? Aortic SL valve. Aortic SL valve. Okay. We'll go back to the PowerPoint slide. So that's the picture we were looking at, and I think it's a good exercise to practice. You know, if you have a whiteboard or something, just kind of like practice this until you have it memorized. Follow a squirt of blood through both pulmonary circuits, through both circuits, pulmonary and systemic. So what they do is they start with the right heart, superior inferior vena cava. Blood is deoxygenated. SVC, IVC, and blood flows to the right atrium. And then, if the valve is open, you go through the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle. So if you follow along, I'm just following the figure. You follow the squirt of blood. Right atrium, right ventricle. Then you got to go through the semilunar valve and pump blood into the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary SL valve, right into the pulmonary trunk. Now, from there, you're going to pump blood through the pulmonary capillaries. So I'll draw it half blue, half red to symbolize oxygen is being picked up in the pulmonary capillaries. I'll just say pul cap for short. It's the job of the pulmonary veins to return this now oxygenated blood to the left heart. Pulmonary veins. Remember, vein in, and we get to the left atrium, LA. Then from there, you go through the bicuspid valve, remember, you can call it the bicuspid valve, you can call it the left AV valve. Another name, forgot to mention, is the mitral valve, also known as the mitral valve. I see that more in clinical circles. Someone thought it looks like a mitre cap, a bishop's mitre. Well, anyways, bicuspid, then you're into the left ventricle. And then the left ventricle will then pump it through the aortic semilunar valve, aortic SL valve. Then you're into the aorta. And the aorta will distribute blood through the whole body, really. And you force blood through the systemic capillaries. So I'll draw half red and then half blue to symbolize gas exchange. Systemic capillaries. And then it's the job of all the systemic veins to collect the blood and return it to the heart, so you just kind of back where you started. Well, anyways, that's a basic figure in most books is teaching students how to follow blood through both circuits. Shift gears a little bit. Let's learn how the heart sits in the chest to get into more anatomy here. So I have a couple pictures to help us with this. When you open the chest cavity, you actually even don't see the heart very much. Most of the space is occupied by the lungs. You can barely see a bit of the pericardium that covers the heart right there. Okay, so that's kind of why I wanted to. I think people expect you open the chest and you see a big beating heart. You might see a little bit there, but not much. Also notice that in this sectional view, the right heart is more anterior than the left heart. Okay, let me write that down. Okay, so I was saying that heart. So in the chest, the right heart is more anterior. Now, you know, when you kind of like put your hand over your heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance, you put it over your left side. But actually, it's closer to the midline. Maybe it's slightly to the left, but the heart pretty much is right behind the sternum at the midline. Here's a model we had in the room of the same section. You can see the four chambers right here. Right and left atria, right and left ventricle. So that's how the heart sits in the chest. Now, the pericardium that covers the heart inside the chest, and we'll talk about the layers of the heart wall too, is symbolized like this. The pericardial cavity is like a water-filled balloon. And the heart, which is about the size and shape of your fist, you kind of punch into it, and it completely envelops and surrounds the heart in this way. Okay? So you can see that the top of the pericardium is attached to these great vessels of the heart that we've been talking about. Superior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk. Inferiorly, it's going to sit right on top of the diaphragm. So this is the pericardium, the covering of the heart. By covering it and anchoring it, it helps hold the heart in place. Because the pericardium has a cavity that's fluid-filled, it provides a frictionless area. I mean, you should know that because it's a double membrane. The part that sits on top of the heart is a visceral pericardium, and the outer part is a parietal pericardium. It's a serous membrane, so I'll put serous in parentheses. Serous means it's what's secreting a fluid. Parietal pericardium is also serous. But there's also a fibrous part that gives it a toughness. It helps anchor it to other organs, so there's some stability in the cavity. Now, the pericardium, because it covers the heart, it prevents overfilling. Okay. filling of the heart with blood. There are clinical things you can study. For example, if you bleed into this pericardial cavity, it's called a cardiac tamponade, like a tampon in female hygiene. You bleed into it. If you bleed into this space, that could squeeze the heart. Okay, that's a clinical emergency there. I won't get too much into that. I really want to just spend time talking about just the layers that you see here, in addition to the pericardium. So what they do is, they take a little picture there and blow it up so you can see how the pericardium is associated with the rest of the heart wall. And then they show you here the fibrous pericardium, how it attaches to the diaphragm. Okay? So the diaphragm is your breathing muscle. And right below the diaphragm is your stomach. Okay? So your heart sits right on top of your stomach. But let's use this to learn the layers of the heart wall. So what we've already written down is that the pericardium is double layered. It's fibrous, it's double layered. It's parietal and visceral. But what we know is that the parietal part is both fibrous and serous. So check that. The parietal pericardium, the outermost layer, is both serous and fibrous. Okay, you already wrote it down. You look at the serous part. It's the part that, as you follow it, it folds in onto the heart wall. Okay? And so when it does that, it creates that pericardial cavity. The purpose of the fibrous part is for fibrous attachment, in this case to the great vessels. Down here, it's attached to the diaphragm. So let me note that. Attaches to great vessels. That's a term I throw around. Usually when anatomists say great vessels, they refer to superior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk. SVC, aorta, pulmonary trunk. So it attaches to the great vessels, diaphragm. So that's the anatomy there. Okay, so we're just going to go from outer to inner and list all of those layers of the heart wall. So we already have the pericardium listed on the board. I don't want to rewrite it. But you should note that between parietal and visceral is the pericardial cavity. That's the fluid-filled thing. Provides a frictionless environment for the heart to beat in. So let's talk about the heart wall itself. This moniker here, heart wall. I mean, basically the heart is, it's mostly muscle. But there are other things we have to mention. Okay, so the heart wall, turns out the visceral layer of the pericardium is the outermost layer of the heart wall, one and the same. So, visceral pericardium, it's one and the same as the epicardium, the outermost layer of the heart wall. Same as epicardium. It's that same serous membrane. They just call it something else. When you get your heart, you'll see that it has a very glistening, kind of a slick appearance because of this layer. gives the heart a very slick looking and smooth looking feel and appearance. Well, anyways, most of the heart is muscle. You just call it the myocardium. Because myo means muscle. And, well, you should know it's cardiac muscle. Because there's 3 muscle types that we teach: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. I'll get into the features of cardiac muscle in another lecture, but just note that for now. It's cardiac muscle. Now, the innermost layer is an endocardium. It touches the blood that fills the chambers. Endo means within, like endometrium, endocardium. Touches blood. So that's the heart wall. If you cut the shoulders off a trunk and look inside, you can see the heart. And they kind of call these figures left side, they call it red side, blue side, because of what you can see. They call the left side the red side because on the left side you tend to see the artery. That's the thoracic aorta. They call the right side the blue side because that's where you see the superior vena cava. So always remember that. What's on the right, what's on the left. Left side is the red side. I'll just put red. Then you have the aorta. Right side is the blue side, because that's where you see the superior vena cava. SVC. Notice you don't see the inferior vena cava. That's because the diaphragm, it comes through the diaphragm. As soon as it goes through the diaphragm, it's immediately in the heart. Okay. Well, let me just put that as a side note. The inferior vena cava, the IVC, books say it has no length. In the thoracic cavity. When we study the abdominal cavity, you'll see it. As soon as it goes through the diaphragm, you're in the thoracic cavity. It's immediately in the heart, so you usually don't see it on pictures like this. All right, I already mentioned this, so go back and look at your notes, maybe note these page numbers. The great vessels of the heart. Superior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk. If you remove everything and just look at the veins, there's some anatomy there I want you to know. Actually, let's stop here. I'm looking at the clock. I want to make sure you have enough time to finish your test. We'll break now. Come back at 9:15. That'll give me enough time to have a break and set the room up for the exam. That'll give you plenty of time to complete the test. When we come back, we'll be all good to go. See you at 9:15.